Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Research and Practical Tips for Palliative Care Clinicians Attending to the Existential Experience. I'm Andrew Andresco with Transforming Chaplaincy, and we are delighted you could all join us. Some housekeeping instructions off the top. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default and are muted. Should you have any technical questions regarding your audio or visual, please type those into the chat box located in the platform's dashboard. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions for our presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of that same control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and hope to include them during a brief Q&A session at the end of today's event. I just want to call your attention to our next webinar, which is on Tuesday, March 26th at 12 p.m. Eastern, regarding clinical pastoral education, the title Boundaries and Dual Role Relationships Within Chaplaincy. I'm going to put that title and registration link into the chat once we get going. With that, I'd like to turn things over to the Director of Transforming Chaplaincy, Csaba Szilagyi.
Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you are joining us for our webinar today. As Andy said, I'm Csaba Szilagyi, the Director for Transforming Chaplaincy, and it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Galshat, especially in his new role with Transforming Chaplaincy. Paul serves as the Assistant Director of Engagement for Transforming Chaplaincy. He is also the convener of Transforming Chaplaincy's Hospice Palliative Spiritual Care Research Network. And he will go ahead and introduce today's presenters. And just wanted to say thank you to Drs. Tarbi, Chochinov, and Rosa for being here today and sharing your expertise. Thank you.
Is there an echo in here? Because I want to amplify the gratitude as well for these experts who have kindly joined us, and I will not waste anybody's time because I want to get to the goodness that they have for us. So Dr. Elise Tarbi is our presenter today. Oh, I forgot about this before we jump in. Sorry, anticlimactic here a little bit, but baseball is something that I love, and we are now, if you are paying attention, friends, to that time around spring training for professional baseball, I am a Minnesota Twins fan. That is Herr Max Kepler. Please consider joining us. We, yes, are primarily composed of chaplains. It's in our name, but our intent is just like palliative care and serious illness to be interprofessional. So we want all comers when it comes to spiritual care. And there's a little QR code. That's the next slide. And with that slide, I want to highlight for you, that's Jackie Robinson. If some of you are not familiar with baseball, someone who played the game with dignity and lived his life as well. I mentioned dignity because I'm guessing you might hear that word along the way as we go today. So those are the introductions. Next slide, if you would, please. Yes, Dr. Tarbi is, if you click to the next animation, please, is at the University of Vermont, where she is in the Department of Nursing there. If you keep clicking those, that'd be great. As a nurse scientist and assistant professor, and many other things. And as I have listed there, we, if you're a baseball fan like me, when a professional player walks to the plate or a pitcher walks in for relief, they have a little song playing. So if this was Elise playing at Fenway here in the crowd, before we all hear Neil Diamond in the 8th inning, she would have All I Do Is Win by DJ Khaled. And I am such a I'm tragically not hip. So did I say his name right? DJ, okay, all right. So Dr. Tarbi, thank you so much for presenting with your expertise. Look forward to the conversation that will unfold with Dr. Chochinov and Dr. Rosa. And then Dr. Chochinov, you're next here for our senior scientist at Cancer Manitoba Research Institute, just north of me here in Minneapolis, in Winnipeg, and is the research lead palliative care and palliative medicine residency program at the University of Manitoba. And if Dr. Chochinov was going to walk to the plate, he would have, yes, from our friends, Freddie Mercury and others, another one bites the dust. And of course, I have to say, as we transition to the next slide, hey, Billy, I'm going to get you too. So Dr. Billy Rosa is at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute, where he's an assistant attending behavioral scientist and so many other things. And from there, we are going to take it back to you, Dr. Tarbi. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us, the expertise, and look forward to this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I believe that I am sharing my PowerPoint slide. Someone just interrupt me if for some reason I'm not, but it looks good to me. So I'm gonna go with it. All right, thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction and for having me today as part of this really inspiring group. Today I'll be sharing with you a little bit about research and practical tips for palliative care clinicians in attending to the existential experience. And this is informed by my research, practice, and lived experience. But I really am looking forward to our conversation all together after my talk, just to understand and be able to learn from the audience here and how this is affecting all of your practice. I just want to start with a moment of gratitude. First, to express gratitude to Transforming Chaplaincy for having us here for this conversation, and for my mentors and collaborators at the University of Vermont in the Department of Nursing, in the Cancer Center, and in the Vermont Conversation Lab, which is where I do most of my research. And to my sources of funding, I've listed them here, and especially to the participants of the studies that I'll be sharing with you a little bit about today. I've also included Lake Champlain chocolates because they really fuel, the Vermont Conversation Lab is really fueled by chocolate, so I felt like I had to honor them. And I've also included a QR code here that links to my bio and many of the citations that I'll be sharing with you today. So today I want to structure my talk around recent work that I've been involved in related to the top 10 tips palliative care clinicians should know about attending to the existential experience. And this has really been a team effort. Many of the names in the article you'll recognize as speakers here today. A group of interdisciplinary scientists, clinicians, patient advocates, and this paper is forthcoming in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. So I'm going to highlight some of these tips in my talk, and then through that, I hope to share with you some of the research that I've done that's informed my thinking around this, specifically related to how we recognize existential concerns in day-to-day conversation. But first, we really have to start out by asking ourselves, what do we mean by existential experience? Irvin Yalom is an existential psychiatrist, and he describes that death is the condition that makes it possible for us to live life in an authentic fashion. And this is really a key tenet of existential psychology, this idea that awareness of death is embedded in who and what we are, and that this life-death tension has the potential to become a source of despair as well as a source of meaning in our life. While we might know this truth throughout our life, diagnosis with a serious illness can really heighten an individual's sense of the fragility of life and increase the urgency of thinking about what it means to be alive. So when we consider existential experience, we can really think about all of the many concerns that come up when an individual confronts the boundaries of life and has to attempt to figure out what this means for their understanding of the self, life, and death. Yalom outlines 4 key existential challenges related to death, freedom and choice, isolation and connectedness, and meaning and meaninglessness. Debilitating existential suffering can result when we really can't cope with these challenges. So for instance, the inevitability and the uncontrollability of our death. And it's characterized by distressing thoughts and emotions like feelings of hopelessness, loss of meaning, feelings of being a burden, and even profound demoralization. So why is it important for us to consider existential experience? First, we know that existential needs are common, but are insufficiently recognized and undertreated in our current healthcare system. Somewhere between 13 and 18% of people living with serious illness experience clinically significant existential suffering. And this suffering can exacerbate physical symptoms, psychological distress, as well as prompt a desire for death. And research shows that this experience of existential suffering can extend to the caregiver as well. While people with serious illness may expect their members of their clinical team to be able to help them navigate these existential challenges, tending to this aspect of personhood is often overlooked, and this can exacerbate suffering. I also want to highlight today in this talk that existential experience can be understood as existing on a spectrum from suffering to openness and joy. And existential growth can occur when individuals can face mortality and cope with those fundamental stressors that are associated with life-limiting illness and integrate them within their life. So as clinicians, we can hold space for this dynamic oscillation along the spectrum, acknowledging suffering while also helping to foster existential growth. In our forthcoming JPM paper, we also outline that whole person palliative care really requires a broad understanding of quality of life, including its existential dimensions. And this understanding is informed by the pioneering work of Dame Cicely Saunders, founder of the modern hospice movement, who introduced the concept of total pain in the 1950s. And today, the National Consensus Project for Quality Palliative Care, which recognizes attention to existential aspects of care in 2 out of the 8 domains of quality palliative care, spanning psychological and spiritual aspects. But despite this importance of existential experience to individuals navigating serious illness and also to quality palliative care delivery, often palliative care clinicians face barriers to delivering existential care. Clinicians report challenges in asking about and identifying existential needs, saying things like, I think it's under-recognized because we don't know how to inquire about it, or we're not good about inquiring about it. And clinicians also report a cultural barrier in the way that we teach and prioritize and incentivize medicine. And this is a quote from a chaplain that I think summarizes this well, saying that so much of medicine is about saving and preventing and fixing. And so in that way, we can devalue attention to the existential experience. In some of my research that I want to share with you today, I've tried to think about how we can address these barriers, and specifically in helping clinicians to recognize existential needs in conversation by asking the question, how do people actually talk about existential experience in palliative care conversations? So to answer this question, we analyzed a subset of conversations from an existing data set that stems from the Palliative Care Communication Research Initiative. So just briefly, this is the parent study, and it was an observational multi-site cohort study spanning Rochester, New York, and San Francisco, California. And it involved hospitalized adults with advanced cancer receiving a palliative care consult, so stage 3 or 4 solid cancer. And overall, the data set included 363 audio recorded palliative care conversations. So those were conversations from 54 palliative care clinicians and 231 patients. And many of the conversations also included family members and close friends. So there was no intervention in this study besides the recording of palliative care conversations as they naturally occurred. So for the study that I'm going to be sharing with you, we took a random subset of conversations from the PCCRI and conducted a qualitative analysis of existential communication. And we understood existential communication as being informed by a conceptual model that I derived from the literature that outlines different dimensions of the experience, where existential experience is understood as a spectrum, like I mentioned before, and is often initiated by confronting mortality or some awareness of death, and involves facing key existential challenges and being able to cope with those or not. Using this understanding of existential experience, we took a qualitative descriptive approach to analysis of actual conversations using content analysis. So in content analysis, that involves an iterative reading of the conversations, looking for key words and phrases about how participants, patients, and families describe their own existential experience, and then using those meaning units into codes and grouping those codes into categories based on the patterns that we were seeing, and then creating themes by looking at the underlying meaning between those categories. So this analytic approach allowed us to create a rich description of existential communication that was really grounded in the words that people were using in natural conversation. So our sample included 30 participants contributing to 38 conversations, and the mean age of the sample was 64, with over half of participants identifying as female and the majority identifying as white. And the average time from day of enrollment to death was 14 days. So this sample represents the population at the study sites where it was conducted, and also what is typically seen for palliative care consultations in terms of disease severity, in that people were pretty sick. Through qualitatively analyzing conversations for existential communication, we found one overarching theme that helped to explain how existential communication arose in conversations, and then 3 sub-themes that help to explain what are the topics that are coming up regarding existential communication. So I'll explain these a bit more in depth with some quotes to help hopefully illustrate what I mean. So first, we found that existential communication was woven within palliative care conversations. And what this meant was that rarely do people describe explicitly existential concerns in conversation, talking about meaning or purpose. And instead, often existential elements, so profound moments of existence, are intermingled with the more practical elements of conversation, like symptom management or treatment decision making. So, as this quote illustrates, this is a conversation where a palliative care clinician is asking a patient about completing an advance directive and says, it's not that we expect them to happen, now or anytime soon. And the patient replies, just like me getting cancer, I didn't expect to get cancer either. And then goes on to sort of explain a bit about the unexpected nature of their illness and about the uncertainty of existence. In this conversation, the clinician pivots back to talking about the advance directive. So you can see here that sometimes existential communication and conversation can present a tension between the pressing clinical tasks at hand and witnessing the patient's existential experience. But while it could present a tension in conversation, we also found that existential communication can be an opportunity. And so this example, I think, helps to illustrate this, where in a conversation about end-of-life treatment choices, the clinician offers, now you may not have thought about anything like this. And the patient goes on to describe, no, I have. I watched my father. And he describes how his father was sustained until he was 101, and he mentions that he thought that was miserable. And then the clinician asks a follow-up and said, is there anything else that you learned from what happened to your father at the end of his life? So in this example, the clinician used their own existential reflection about the death of their father and the meaning of that suffering to probe a little bit deeper into what that means for their own end-of-life thinking. One key theme in existential communication had to do with time. Often in conversations, patients, caregivers, clinicians talked about time as a pressing boundary and a way to get oriented. And they created 2 timelines. A medical timeline that had to do with notable medical dates, things like dates of diagnosis, hospital admissions, in this quote, a biopsy. And then they crafted an existential timeline in reaction to that medical timeline when they charted that medical timeline across their life course, putting it into perspective of their existence, saying things like, I just didn't realize how old I was until this happened. Often in this process of keeping time in these 2 realities, time was conceptualized as a precious and dwindling resource. And you can get a sense of that in how people describe time in natural conversation. So often people talk about losing time. They talk about not wanting to waste time. They talk about a treatment that might just be buying time. They talk about how they want to spend their time. And they talk about attempts to make that time as rich as possible. So when an individual uses these phrases about time, it can give us a sense that a person is working on thinking about what it means to be living on a limited timeline and how to make that time as meaningful as possible. Another key theme in existential communication had to do with striving to maintain a coherent self in a changing landscape of illness and dying. So often people talked about in conversation their changing bodies, their changing capacities, and how their changing abilities reflected for them a change in identity. And so you could see that in the ways that people talked about things like, I just can't live a normal life, or talking about feeling like they weren't their normal self anymore. Or when family members said things like, it's not her, reflecting on the changed existence of their loved one. People described connecting with family, care providers, and God, or some transcendent element in conversation, and they often described this connection as a source of strength during serious illness, but it could also be a source of suffering when challenged. One piece I just wanted to highlight today in this group was how people talked about how meaningful their relationships were with their care team. And they often talked about their palliative care team as walking with them during serious illness. And they described how isolated they could feel when they weren't supported by their care team. So in this quote, the patient is talking about feeling blown off by their clinician. And they said, "I'm alone and I had nowhere to talk to, no one to talk to. I had nowhere to go." Within these conversations, we also looked at the relationship between existential communication and prognosis communication, or what to expect in the course of one's illness. And we found that they were deeply interconnected. You could really see that in the way that people talked about what to expect when clinicians ask patients, what does it look like when you look at the future, what does that look like to you? And in this example, the patient answers, drab, it'll be an existence, not a lifestyle, and then goes on to talk about bicycle riding and kayaking. So you can sort of see that people are looking at their future through two lenses. One lens that's informed by prognostic understanding or an understanding of their functional trajectory, and then this complementary lens that has to do with what that means for their existence. So these findings really help to inform our understanding of tip 7, that clinicians can use existing communication skills to explore existential experience. Hopefully these excerpts from actual palliative care conversations can help us all better recognize the ways that existential communication shows up in conversation, in sometimes explicit and sometimes more subtle ways. And we can listen to the way that people talk about how they spend their time, how they understand their changing body and therefore their changing self, and how they might maintain connection to their social world as they're going through this transformation. And we can especially be attentive to conversations surrounding prognosis, or what to expect in a person's disease course, that existential issues are likely to arise in these conversations, and we can recognize and respond to them. I think it's important just to acknowledge some of the limitations of this work and how it's informing my next steps. So in this study that I shared with you, the participants were they were adults with advanced cancer in the inpatient palliative care setting in a sample that was predominantly English-speaking, white, and Christian. So this sample lacked sufficient variation in cultural, spiritual, or linguistic backgrounds of participants, meaning that the findings really represent a specific cultural context, and it may limit the transferability to other contexts. This is informing my next steps in trying to understand and study conversations in new contexts. Specifically, I'm looking at telehealth conversations as a way to get outside of the traditional inpatient academic medical center environment and into more places where diverse people live. And I'm also looking at existential communication and psychedelic-assisted therapy encounters, just to try to understand a new lens through which we can look at existential communication. Okay, so now that we're all experts in recognizing existential concerns, what do we do? How can we respond? In our JPM paper, we outline that holistic interventions can help clinicians attend to patients' existential experiences and can be integrated throughout all types of clinical care. So while we honor and acknowledge that chaplains, social workers, psychologists, many of the people on this call have specialized training in responding to existential concerns, all palliative care clinicians have a responsibility to attend to and accompany patients and families through this facet of their experiences as part of an interdisciplinary team. So this involves first contending with our own desire to fix suffering rather than accompanying patients and families while they're experiencing existential distress, and really knowing that this simple act of bearing witness can be therapeutic for everyone in the encounter. And then we also talk about that effective interventions have been developed and tested to support patients and families navigating existential distress. For instance, meaning-centered therapies like dignity therapy. And we're so lucky to be joined by Dr. Chochinov today, who I hope can tell us a little bit more about how we can integrate practices from dignity therapy into our everyday clinical practice. However, we talk a little bit about in our paper that it may not be feasible for people to pursue training to deliver these therapies, or to have the time in their daily practice to deliver these therapies in full. So for instance, I teach nursing students, and I want the students that I teach to be comfortable responding to existential distress in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. when it's just them and the patient. So in our JPM paper, we used the work of Hoff and colleagues who synthesized the literature and came up with 5 key existential strengths that we can bolster in conversation. And they talk about meaning, connection, agency, hope, and faith. So I'll outline, just for the sake of time, one of these dimensions, and I'll talk a little bit about how we can support meaning. So clinicians can assist patients and families in upholding a sense of meaning in their days through asking questions to encourage valued normal aspects of existence. So what are some normal routines you miss? How can we get you back to them? Getting back to that idea of people feel attached to their normal life or their normal self, and that may be something they're experiencing distance from. We can ask patients about what has been and what continues to be most important to them. What are the important roles that they've played, and what have they felt most proud of in their life? And we can also assist patients in finding sanctuaries or refuge from daily pressures. So I was lucky enough in this work to think about, with Adam Hayden, a friend and colleague and person who's living with brain cancer, the idea that refuge might come in the form of bracketing. So refuge might come in the form of sanctuaries, places where patients can feel replenished, things like going out in nature. But refuge also might come from bracketing or a shift in perspective. So pushing thoughts, negative thoughts and feelings to the background as something else comes to the foreground. And he offered this example of how he found refuge in activities of daily living, talking about, I'm often asked how I managed to accept my terminal diagnosis, and I often reply, you assume that I have. But the more authentic response is that by learning to walk again, to bathe independently, to feed myself, to toilet without assistance, by orienting toward achieving functional goals, I bracketed the diagnosis and found well-being in the pursuit of healing. One emerging area of research that I've become involved in through my postdoc at Dana-Farber and now at the University of Vermont is the potential for psychedelic-assisted therapy to meet patients' unmet existential needs. So this work is ongoing, but I'll just share a little bit with you today. For those that aren't familiar, psychedelic-assisted therapy combines the use of psychedelic medicines, for instance, psilocybin mushrooms, so things that induce a non-ordinary state of consciousness, with psychotherapeutic support. And usually that's in 3 parts: a preparatory session, a dosing day, and integration sessions after. And what we've found through strong preliminary evidence supports that psychedelic-assisted therapies can be safely delivered to people living with serious illness, and it can lead to pronounced and sustained improvements in depression and anxiety, as well as existential suffering. So I'm currently involved in work that's analyzing the actual therapeutic encounters between patients and clinicians all across psychedelic-assisted therapy, so from the preparatory day through integration, as well as through semi-structured interviews after. And these were participants with cancer and depression who completed group psilocybin-assisted therapy in a trial that was through the Aquilino Cancer Center in Maryland. And through qualitative analysis of participant interviews, I've been exploring how patients with cancer and depression describe their existential journey of both cancer and psychedelic-assisted therapy. And overall, a key finding has been that many participants describe the lasting effects of psychedelic-assisted therapy as a healing transformation. And they note that they have an increased sense of meaning, as well as a discovery of new tools for coping with both cancer and death anxiety. So I just have one quote from a participant I think helps to illustrate that. This was a person who talked about searching for spiritual connection prior to their psychedelic-assisted therapy encounter. And afterwards, they talk about that all of a sudden, an entire part of my psyche has opened up. They talk about, now I see a way forward. So I'm interested in this research because psychedelic-assisted therapy can offer a space for patients to do important existential work. And I think for researchers and clinicians, we can better understand through psychedelic-assisted therapy, these underlying processes and how to support them both within and outside this type of therapy. Oops. So taking all of this together, I just want to leave you with a few ideas today. First, that attention to existential experience is really central to palliative care, and that we have opportunities in our everyday clinical practice to listen to the ways that people bring up their full spectrum of existential experience, especially in conversations about prognosis. And lastly, that palliative care clinicians can use the communication tools that they already have to respond, as well as adapting holistic interventions. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I hope that this has spurred some questions for you. I included a picture here of Lake Champlain in Vermont. If you ever come through, please reach out. And I included the QR code again that links to some of the citations of the articles that I discussed today.
Thank you, Dr. Tarbi. I'd like to welcome, Dr. Chochinov, Dr. Rosa, take it away. I'm going to step away from you now. Yeah, wonderful job. I totally agree, Dr. Rosa. Thank you, Elise.
Did I stop sharing my screen?
You did.
Okay.
Go ahead, Harvey. Why don't you start us?
First I have to begin, Elise, by saying what an extraordinary job. That was really a lovely presentation, and not that I should be surprised, because you and I have had the opportunity to do some work together, me in a very kind of peripheral way, on the 10 tips that you've prepared for the Journal of Palliative Medicine, which I think is just going to be a lovely contribution to the literature. So thank you for taking the lead on that, and thank you for today's presentation. It was really extraordinary and so well done. I'm not terribly organized in my comments. I just was sort of writing down things as you were speaking, and of course I feel like we need another hour to at least to begin to unpack so many of the things that you brought up. You early on mentioned Irv Yalom and the idea that one has to have this awareness of death in order to live authentically, and it reminded me of something that I've looked at in the course of providing and developing dignity therapy, which, as you mentioned, is kind of a brief psychological intervention based on the notion of generativity, giving people an opportunity to create something that will even be transcendent of their death. And one of the terms that I've come up with, and I talk about it in my training, is something that I call existential readiness. So how do you know when a patient is ready to engage in this exercise around generativity, creating a legacy? And we have identified this notion of existential readiness as being a place that people arrive to, whether by virtue of illness or age or life calamity, that puts them in a space where they feel being reflective, being in a place to reflect on where they've been and to share that in a way that will be transcendent of death is an important thing for them to engage in. So it's become an important way of our conveying to trainees. This is kind of how you will identify when patients might actually look at this as being something that is, potentially therapeutic. You also mentioned the importance of time, and it's an interesting issue to contemplate in patients for whom time is a limited commodity. One of the things, and this goes back to a paper I wrote long ago, but talked a little bit about this idea of a hope and end of life. And think about it. I mean, we've got people for whom prognosis is hopeless in terms of a protracted period of survival. And yet, and this goes back to early studies, we know that, the vast majority aren't either clinically depressed or suffering from hopelessness, which then led to the kind of the conclusion and observation that it seems to be the one time in life when hope becomes uncoupled from time. hope is usually based on some time expectancy. This will happen. The future will provide this or that. Whereas towards the end of life, hope resides in something that is much more in the here now, much more about issues related to kind of meaning and purpose, as opposed to the hope for protracted survival. You mentioned this idea of, and by the way, a lovely study, and I meant to say, it's so important that we're doing, and collectively that so many of us have done and continue doing these studies on things that may seem really kind of ephemeral. But what happens, and at least I can tell you've already had this experience. You start to delve into something that just feels like this, rabbit hole, existential rabbit hole, if you will, and you wonder, so what am I going to find? I mean, is it conceivable that I'm going to find anything that is going to yield anything other than something that may be kind of intellectual interest, but still feel kind of vague and ephemeral? And what you end up coming with is practical insights, ways of being able to guide patients in a way that is going to be more effective. And your studies are already beginning to do that. Even this idea that communication is woven into conversation. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to reflect on, that this is not about a singular dialogue that we all need to learn. This is about learning to weave the threads into the cloth of communication that is already happening. And so just to say how important it is that, that you're doing this work. And in that work, you also talked about maintaining a coherent sense of self. And in some ways, it kind of segues to something that I've been writing about and thinking about, and I think is related to the therapeutic opportunities that you create or that you mention, which is this whole notion of affirmation. What is it that would we do when we ask people to reflect on their lives, or to engage in reminiscence, or to find out what's important to them? It really is to create a space of affirmation, to say, you are still important. I know that you may have all kind of functional encumbrances, but you are still important, and you referenced Dame Saunders, you matter because you are you. And maybe just, and again, I don't want to dominate all of the time, and I see Billy just waiting to jump in with really the quintessential point that is going to bring all of this together. But Dame Saunders has been on my mind for some time, and it was really her inspiration, this idea of you matter because you are you, which led me to writing an article that looked at how can we operationalize that. I mean, it's well and good to say you matter, but how do we, in fact, invoke the kind of care that says you matter, that affirms you matter? And that's where the article on intensive caring and the various elements of intensive caring that I've written about, I think segue nicely into this conversation and how we begin to be attentive to these kind of existential issues that you so beautifully laid out. So those are some opening thoughts.
Well, now I don't know where to start, because I have all of my notes for Elise over here and all of my notes for Harvey over here. And so let's see if I can accomplish something like what Harvey alluded to about tying things together. But yeah,
if anyone can, Billy.
Well, I just want to second how incredible that was, Elise. I've been listening to Elise reflect and refine and build this work for 7 years now. And, as colleagues in our PhD program, and then reading her dissertation, which was so brilliant, and continuing to be so privileged to be a part of her work. And Elise, I just have to say, just from my heart, I'm so grateful that you do this work, because every time I listen to you, it's like a whole part of my mind and heart open up and go, oh, yes. It's like connecting these dots of these everyday practices and processes, and all of these topics that I see, in terms of the clinical space of whether it's, what you're tying together, telehealth, psychedelic-assisted therapy, just basic clinician-patient communication, and how you're weaving the real profound moments of existence, as you put it, throughout all of that is so incredible. And so maybe I'll just give some of my reflections, and then I'll defer to where Elise wants to take the conversation. But one of the things that Harvey was just talking about was this concept of existential readiness. And what really hit me was the broader inquiry about readiness and existential readiness, not just from the patient perspective, but from their care partner's perspective, from the clinician's perspective, and from the environments that we work in, right? What do the environments say about how we either promote or take away the opportunities to really leverage that readiness? And so I've just been thinking about that, because one of the tips that you articulated in the paper, the top 10 paper, was in reference to clinicians. When we explore our own existential experience, we can find ways to hold space for our own distress, which may also resonate with patients. And when I think about effective communication versus ineffective communication, or empathic communication versus unempathic or biocidic communication, you know, I'm constantly thinking about what is the comfort level of clinicians and the capacity of clinicians to really reflect and get in touch with their own existential experience, right? Because I think that we don't talk about that, how much and how significant that must be in driving the conversations that do or do not take place, and then the quality of those conversations, and the willingness to probe or acknowledge or validate or normalize, right? And to really move from that kind of professional context of relationship to a real human to human based connection in the clinical context. And so I think the readiness question is so huge, because I think it also ties into maybe clinicians and systems' fears, worries, apprehensions about truly acknowledging how social injustice and social factors play into the existential distress of our patients, right? I was thinking about one of the first images you showed was the visual analog scale of existential distress, and you know, the severe person on the right had like the whole world on their back. And I was just thinking how many, you know, people I know, you know, some of my trans friends who I think feel like they walk through the world like that, or how many of my Black friends feel like they walk through the world like that. That is baseline. That's baseline existential distress. That's really perpetuated by structural issues and social factors that are so unavoidable for so many people. And then you layer on prognostic uncertainty, and you layer on inhumane health settings, and you think, wow, I mean, they're just amazing how people even get out of bed in the morning sometimes. And so I also thought about that in the image that you shared from your dissertation, where, you know, you had personal factors informing that on the left. And I was thinking about where the social factors and the structural barriers play into that model, because it's unavoidable. And I think we, and as clinicians, and our inability or our ability to reflect on our existential experience directly informs how we hold space for that for the patient. And I think that's really, it's just really something that needs to be incorporated into disease context conversations. And yet I don't think we do a very good job about it. I will say that your reflections on time, the first theme that you talked about, the pressing boundary of time, I was like typing away like crazy over here, because I was thinking like, wow, that really, I think I need to go back to my own drawing board. I think that shook me awake a little bit in terms of how we talk about quality versus quantity, and how, you know, we talk about a lot of us in palliative care talk about, well, it's about quality over quantity. But this whole idea of brushing up against time, whether it's buying more time or thinking about how we use the time, does get to that quantitative factor. It does. It's not just about how we spend it. It is about the very essence of it, which goes back to quantity. And maybe it's about the fear of the quantity, or the uncertainty about, you know, in terms of numerical power, how much of it we have left. But I think, you know, quantity may be just as important a part of that conversation in those existential communications. And I think that that's something that I might have overlooked over the last 15 years. It's just brilliant the way you put it. And this faulty notion of, I don't know if it was you that said it, but the faulty notion of that we'll always have enough time, right? Like really have to delve into this concept of quantity versus quality. I'm rambling on that a little bit, but and then the last thought I had was around the psychedelic-assisted therapies, and I'm so glad you're doing that work, because I think, you know, communication and existential care is such a missing component to that work and to that science. And I think tremendous focus on the dosing intervention itself. For people who are listening who may be less familiar with the intervention, right, you have this preparation phase where you are getting some education about how the psychedelic experience occurs, even though you could never quite capture that in a didactic sense, right? But some preparation about how the dosing will work, some psychological assessment, psychological care, really establishing the relationship between the psychedelic therapist and the patient. Then you have the dosing session itself, which depending on the psychedelic could be 4 to 8 hours. And then the integration side, right, which has taken lots of different models, days, weeks, months, individual group settings. But I think that integration component is where most people in psychedelic-assisted therapy would say we're lacking in terms of quality and really like agreed upon structure of what that should look like. And I think that is the biggest area that could truly benefit from existential care research and existential bolstering in terms of communication, because people have just had this profound, what they typically describe as this profound transcendent experience that really helps them to recharacterize and redefine their life, their purpose, their meaning, the time they have left, their relationship to their disease, so many different aspects of who they are and how they see themselves. And yet, without the proper communication, without the proper caring environment, they won't have the opportunity to redefine their existence. And I think, you know, there may be times they may not be able to give language to it, but I think we really need to do our best to help them give language to and wrap their minds around this new existence, post-psychedelic dosing, right? And give them the opportunity to do that. Yeah, so those are my thoughts.
I have a question, Elise. Have you given any thought to kind of the knowledge translation piece with respect to the publication of the JPM article? I mean, it's fabulous. I mean, what you've done is it's extraordinary. You've pulled it together. It reads beautifully. But is it a moment in the field? Or could we make it, or could you, together with the rest of us, could it be made into a moment in the field with the right kind of KT strategy? Because it's one thing to put it out there and say, well, you know, hope everyone reads it. But is there something that might be done to say, you know, this is a moment in time in which, you know, one of the leading palliative care journals on the planet has recognized that there are some quintessential facets of care that affect all humans. You know, I mean, these are kind of cross-cultural. Might there be something to be done in trying to kind of elevate the profile of the paper and this moment in time and what it marks? You know, I'd love to brainstorm with you on that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond to that question, and then gosh, I feel like I have so many thoughts, so we'll all have to connect after this as well, because I would love to talk more about how we do get this knowledge out there. But for me, it's actually bringing up something else you mentioned about existential readiness, and I almost wonder if there's an existential readiness of our field that's been evolving, because for me, it's synergistic with like our field's interest in psychedelic-assisted therapies and thinking about how we might mitigate suffering through these therapies that are really at their core, like they tend to this aspect of experience. So I'm wondering if there's like a momentum of palliative care where we have this readiness now to think in a new way of building a system, reimagining a system that can meet people's needs, meet these needs that have often gone unattended to.
And I don't think those can be separated from the larger existential pressures of the planet and what's happening in terms of conflict around the world and what's happening in terms of the MAID debates happening in so many different countries in different ways. I mean, there are a lot of existential pressures in the social planetary space that I think where the field is also identifying more strategic ways that palliative care can be integrated into these responses and into these into the scholarship and into the science. But I think layering it with that broader readiness and real need is so key.
Yeah, so one can begin to envision some kind of a global event or a series of global events, seminars that perhaps are led by, an identified individual in the field for each of the 10 tips, and hosted in a place like Sloan Kettering or Harvard Medical School, or a place that is going to kind of have a certain amount of kind of gravitas, and baked in credibility, and we invite the global community who have a vested interest in affirming the good of people, acknowledging our kind of shared humanity, in talking about the lessons learned and summarized in that paper. I don't know, there's just lots of ideas, but the one thing that we wouldn't want, I had this, this is a little anecdote. Years ago, we published a paper, and this many years ago, published a paper, and I thought, oh, geez, we better do a KT event. So I remember we went to the hospital where we had done this, and I had copies of my paper, and I did a little presentation, and I handed it out to everybody. And at the end of it, my research nurse came up to me, she said, Harvey, nobody reads your papers. And I said, Bev, that is very helpful. Is, just putting it out there and, handing out some copies of your paper, that doesn't get you need to find a way of making it accessible. So I'll never forget when she said, nobody reads your papers. Well, maybe, hopefully some people do. But the point is, you need to find, it's one thing to publish, but it's another thing to get the word out, to make this something that is transformative, or at least, if not transformative, at least helps to accelerate the momentum, because Billy, as you said, maybe this is a moment of existential readiness for the field.
Let's hope this Transforming Chaplaincy webinar is the kickoff event.
We appreciate that. I mean, you're using some of the key words, transformative, and friends, this will be posted on YouTube, and we hope that this will be going on in perpetuity. At least before we take maybe a question or two from the 150 plus folks, thank you so much for joining us as well. It means a lot to us. Elise, anything you want to say in response to Billy or Harvey? I mean, like Harvey said, I mean, this could go on and on. This was existential dopamine for me. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to say before we take one of these questions.
No, I would love to hear some questions from the audience. I think I'll just say overall, just again, gratitude to Harvey and to Billy for joining me in this and for helping me, thinking through all of the top 10 tips. One of the pieces that you mentioned, Harvey, is the importance of measuring things that are hard to measure. And that's, I feel like, that's like palliative care's whole problem, right? Is thinking about how can we measure the things that we're doing as a field that are really affecting meaning. To me, it's like a foundational question for us about existential experience, but also about what is, high quality care and conversation. So that's kind of what I'm left thinking about is that's sort of our mission, I think.
Wheels are turning for both you and Billy. Harvey, do you want to take the bait and say something before I jump in with a question?
Well, I was just going to add on to that and say, and to kind of have the courage to be able to study and engage in things that even defy measurement. There are just some profound things that happen in the course of our work that you may not be able to quantify, but the impacts are profound. Getting back to the dignity therapy anecdote that comes to mind, I remember a young woman who came to me after we had completed dignity therapy, and she said, in this document is the only time my father ever told me he loved me. Now, I don't think I can measure that, but and I think in some ways it defies measurement, but let's not mistake the fact that it can't be readily measured for being the equivalent to, well, therefore it doesn't matter. It matters profoundly.
Really, anything to that?
Yeah, I did want to get to the audience, but I'll just add, when both of you were just speaking, it made me think of a recent panel I've been a part of and updating palliative care guidelines for a cancer organization that should be out this spring. And in looking at those guidelines, one of the questions we asked ourselves, was what is the place of expert consensus and community-based wisdom and knowledge in the absence of empirical data, which when it comes to historically underrepresented groups, we have so little of. And I think to Harvey's point and to the whole, foundation of this topic, it really requires all ways of knowing. And just because we can't provide empirical measurement doesn't mean it doesn't exist and doesn't mean it's not important. And so to the bigger conversation of maybe this is a moment in the field, maybe this is also a moment in the field to do it differently. And use this whole concept of existential care that I was really touched by the way you framed it as profound moments of existence, which I think really just resonated with me because I don't have to be philosophical about a definition. I'm just like, oh, I get that. This is about tapping into profound moments of existence and anchoring myself into those as a clinician. That maybe it's a way of teaching the field to have these kinds of dialogues in different ways beyond the empiricism that very much limits us around topics of this nature.
Thank you, Billy. So friends, I'm going to let you at least take a look at this. I'm going to probably get to one question, but I missed announcing Billy's walk-up song, and I think it's a fitting kind of getting to the conclusion. Tina Turner, friends, sings Simply the Best, and this has been simply the best. So thank you. Earlier, friends, you also saw in the link in the chat there was a way to get into our research networks. One of our research networks is psychedelic spiritual care research. So if you're interested in that, we can get you connected to those folks and go from there. One of the questions I think, Elise, that came up has been addressed a little bit, and that was time related to, I'm a busy clinician. We got 7 new consults on the team this morning. I got to get in to see these people. I got a care conference at 1, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. How am I going to get to this in 1 minute or less?
Yeah, in 1 minute or less. Okay. Actually, so what I will say is I think we can lean on some of the research that's been done in terms of empathic communication, where there's a study that James Tulsky did and colleagues that measured actually the amount of time it added to a consult to have an empathic response. And it was something like 17 seconds. And they saw a profound increase in trust in a clinician after that intervention. And it was so simple, but not really. But I think for me, my takeaway from that is if we can actually respond to these cues in the moment, I don't think it has to take so much more time. And I think that the human connection that we build in saying like, yes, I'm brave enough to face this with you, even though there's no answers and I don't know what to do about it either. I am gonna be with you here no matter what. That's so powerful. And I think we'll get that time back. I don't know, that's how I feel.
Thank you. We are at 2 o'clock. Doctors Tarbi, Chochinov, and Rosa, this was a grand slam of an event. Thank you for what you offered us. And friends, if you're going to be in Phoenix for the HPNA, I hope to see you there. And I want to say to the presenters, I owe you all something like a cup of coffee or your favorite beverage for being with us today. So thanks, friends, to all of you. Take care.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Can we talk? It was simply the best, Elise. Simply the best.